We saw from reading Singer how important the conditional premise was to his argument. The simple logical words if and then in the second premise of his argument are what gave it a logically valid form. And that is where the force of the argument came from. So it's time that we learn a little bit more about the kinds of thought that are expressed by those little words. It's time to learn about conditionals. What all conditionals have in common is they say if one thing is true, then some other thing must be true as well. For example, they claim that if there's trouble, George will find it. It's a conditional. It's convenient to have names for the parts of a conditional. Since the first part of a conditional comes first, we'll call it the antecedent after the Latin word ante. And since the second part of the conditional comes after, we'll call it the consequent after the Latin word consequi. This will be important to remember. Conditionals such as were Singer's friend when he constructed his argument, and they will be your friend too. Make friends with them now, and they will be there for you when you need them, all semester long. Since a conditional means that if its antecedent is true, then its consequent must be true as well. Any argument whose premises include a conditional and its antecedent, whose conclusion is the consequent of the conditional, is a valid argument. Since that is a form or pattern such that every argument with that pattern is valid, it follows that every argument that has that pattern is by definition formally valid. Conditionals are so important, and this argument form is such an important part of why conditionals are important, that we also have a Latin name for this particular argument form. It's called modus ponens. Many other valid argument forms and some invalid forms also have names, but you won't need to use or remember the names of other forms in this class. The modus ponens is special. You will rely on it extensively all semester long, and so you will need to remember its name. When we use conditionals in class, we will always write them down like this one, if P then Q. But when you encounter sentences with conditional meanings in the wild, they will not always look like this. Conditional meanings can be expressed with many different words in English and many different kinds of construction. So whenever you encounter a sentence that you think has a conditional meaning, it's helpful to write down an arrow that tells you which part of the sentence is the antecedent by the root of the arrow and which part is the consequent by the head of the arrow. It's possible, but a waste of time, to try to memorize which way the arrow goes in many different English constructions that express conditional meanings. But they're hard to remember, and some can be confusing, especially if we choose the subject matter poorly. The best, most rock-solid way to be sure which way the arrow goes is always to check which choice makes modus ponens seem valid. For example, if the arrow goes from left to right, then this inference should be a good one. And if the arrow goes the other way, then this one should be valid. If in doubt, we can always change the non-conditional words in the sentence to make sure that we're not being misled by our background knowledge. For example, this conditional has the potential to be confusing because we happen to know that in reality both directions of the arrow are true. We can eliminate that by changing the subject. Now we can see that it really is impossible that you tuck but don't roll, if to tuck you have to roll. The arrow goes, therefore, from left to right. And I encourage you to pause here and try it again to think through that for yourself. Okay, so far we've covered what conditionals are, given an intuitive take on why they make modus ponens formally valid, and explored the confusing relationship between conditional meanings and natural language sentences. We have one more topic to cover, which is what makes conditionals false. The only thing that you need to remember about what makes a conditional false is that it is false when its antecedent is true and its consequent is false. For example, the antecedent of this conditional is true if George lets go. Its consequent is false if George does not fall. So the conditional is false if George lets go and does not fall. Why wouldn't he fall? He might be standing on a chair, or he might be being held by the man in the yellow hat. It doesn't matter. Either way, the conditional claim that if he lets go, he will fall is false. It will take much more practice for you to become adept at recognizing conditional meanings in the wild and identifying which way their arrows go. But we now know enough about conditionals for them to be your very best friend in this course. Whenever you recognize that an argument has the form of modus ponens, you will never need to substitute words in order to be sure whether it's formally valid or not. You can just rely on your memory that this is a valid argument form. And that is a good thing, because most of the arguments that we look at all semester will use conditionals, including all of the ones that you make up yourselves. Make friends with them now, and they will do you good later.